Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the government shutdown, the Labour government's move to introduce digital ID in Great Britain, and the plan for peace in Gaza. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So the government is shut down. Some people I know were driving around Kansas and Missouri visiting national parks and historic sites like the Brown v. Board of Education site, and their trip is suspended because the federal government is shut down. I've been following this a bit. One big point of contention is whether or not healthcare for illegal immigrants is involved. The Republican administration says that the Democrats are demanding that healthcare be given to illegal immigrants, and Democrats are denying this. On this one point, it really reflects the fact that whether someone is an illegal immigrant or legally present in the country has come to be a kind of complex question, and it's become a politically contentious one, especially in the wake of the Biden administration. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, whose president, Mark Krikorian, is a contributor to Compact, the Biden administration granted what's called parole to close to 3 million, call them undocumented migrants, call them illegal immigrants. And that's a kind of legal status. So you could look at them as being here in the country legally, but they also, could be viewed as here illegally and not having a legitimate claim to Medicaid. So that's one of the points of contention. And I think, my own sense is that these kinds of fights just naturally follow from the sorts of ways the Biden administration bent our immigration law, massively expanding what were supposed to be relatively limited modes of regularization like parole. But yeah, I don't know. Geoff, what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, if your friends are still on this trip, they should go visit the Mormon history sites in that region, because those will not be shut down. The Mormon Church will, keep running them like a well-oiled machine, and they can go check out, Independence, Missouri, and Nauvoo, and these various places in the early history of the Mormon Church.
It's a good point, but my friends are actually engaged, and it's a very kind of pious sort of civic American experience. You can get kind of stamps at a national park or national historic site kind of verifying that you've visited. And some people kind of collect all these stamps. And so if you collect them all, you essentially see the nation's natural splendor and visit all of its significant sites, from the Battle of Little Bighorn to Stonewall, right? So it's maybe a very poorly timed trip, because their specific purpose is to go to federal sites.
Okay. Whereas the Mormon history sites commemorate a sort of rogue state within, that at that time was existing in opposition to the federal government. Right. But in any case, let's leave that aside and return to your question. I do think this point of, so, the simple point with regard to maybe it's not a simple point with regard to this whole question of sort of funding healthcare for illegal immigrants, is that the problem is that I think at Compact generally think the record of the Biden administration in this area was quite bad, and have published many things critical of it. Unfortunately, the fact remains that these people are here, and some of them are going to end up in the hospital. And then the question of how the hospital is going to be reimbursed for their care, much of which will not be covered by insurance because they won't have private insurance, is going to come up. And so, because there's simply no, the hospitals are legally required to provide them with, say, emergency care if they show up in the emergency room. They can't just turn them away and let them, die in the street or whatever. And so then the question is, how does the hospital get paid for providing this care? And so this is one of the things that Medicaid funding does, as I understand it. And, this is part of the problem with the Biden administration's record, that it does strain all of these services. Although, people will claim otherwise. But, and so I think that there's sort of an aspect of this that is not going to be solved by any funding cut, in fact, because these hospitals are going to either be reimbursed or they're going to pass on the costs to other entities, whether by, charging, whether by increasing their reimbursement rates to insurance, or another possibility is that some of these hospitals will simply go out of business because they are not reimbursed by Medicaid for providing certain services. And so this is something that has come up in relation to the cuts to Medicaid, that it might result in various particularly rural hospitals going out of business. And so I think, there's a great deal of sort of, I'd say, sort of dishonesty on both sides of this question, in terms of, on one hand, the fact that introducing millions of new people who are going to rely on government services is going to create problems and is going to create resentment, and there's not really any way around that. And so this is just something that progressives have not been serious about in recent years. And so this is part of how we ended up in this pickle. On the other hand, I think the Republican and the White House position on this is fundamentally dishonest, because the hospitals are essentially required to, if someone shows up, they're required to tend to them regardless of whether they have insurance, and then that money is going to be paid from somewhere or the other. So then the question is just, what's the most efficient way of dealing with this problem? And so generally Medicaid is the way that that's been addressed. But it also results in other things, like, again, higher, for people who don't have insurance but also have, the wherewithal to pay for, who perhaps have high deductible insurance. The sticker price of various procedures is going to be higher, because the costs of providing care to the indigent and uninsured are going to be passed on to someone or the other. So then the question is, what's the most efficient and equitable way of doing that? So, this is symptomatic of how broken our whole healthcare system is. And I think, this entire thing is a sideshow on some level. It's symptomatic of how broken our immigration system has been as well. So what do we have here? Well, we have a legislative entity that is unable to kind of do its job, and is often unwilling to do its job, and would rather just kind of allow the executive, whether Biden or Trump, to essentially expand its powers through executive decrees or, the various measures taken by the Biden administration to, as you said, kind of expand these categories of parole, or the many things the Trump administration has done to, essentially arrogate more power to itself. So we have a legislature that's incapable of functioning. This is a long story. We had government shutdowns over the past decade a number of times. This isn't new. So we have a legislature that's incapable of functioning. We have a broken immigration system, and we have a broken healthcare system. So, these are all just symptoms of a deeper dysfunctionality that has deep roots, and that both parties have a great deal of responsibility for. And yet both are sort of attempting to blame the other. And the other thing that I'd add to this, which I think is sort of the more serious argument on the Democratic side that I've seen as well. We've seen this return of rescission or impoundment. That basically the executive branch has claimed the ability to refuse to use funds that were allocated by Congress. And so then if this is the case, then it sort of further encourages the dysfunction of the legislature, because if the legislature can appropriate funds and then the White House can simply unilaterally refuse to actually use them, then it's unclear what the point of the appropriation process is, at least if this is taken to its logical conclusion. And so I think that does, I don't think the shutdown or the dysfunctionality of immigration or healthcare, these are both longstanding problems with our system that go back decades. This situation in which the legislature in which the executive can rescind funding appropriated by the legislature does seem to have brought us to a new impasse that, is again, I think it's concordant with this larger process by which the legislature has just essentially relinquished most of its responsibilities and functions to the executive. And so now we're at this point where it's kind of unclear what what the purpose of the legislature should be at all, if you at least take this to its logical conclusion.
Exactly. I mean, when Congress's role is so greatly limited, and this is part of a kind of long drawn out process, one that's being advanced under the Trump administration, but has a much deeper history. If it's not really crafting legislation, sort of determining government policy, and those functions have largely been granted to the executive, then that's going to have kind of strange effects on the way Congress works. I think congressmen find it convenient in certain ways to outsource responsibility to the executive, and they've increasingly become kind of influencers. I mean, think of when Ben Sasse was in the Senate, and he, as a senator from Nebraska, and he, did some things legislatively, but he largely kind of functioned as if he were an AEI fellow. He kind of put out thoughtful middlebrow books from a temperate conservative perspective, and similarly, AOC is, she engages in lawmaking functions, but she does a lot of social media posting. Ted Cruz has a podcast. So they've kind of given up responsibility, even as the executive has tried to take it away from them. But then voters do want them to do something. And specifically, the Democratic base really wants to see some kind of sign of life from Democratic legislators. It wants to see some fight from them, because the Democratic base is very, very worried about what the Trump administration is doing. So this shutdown just seems like the one kind of leverage that they have available to them. And you'd like to think that if Congress were more broadly active, it wouldn't have to come to this pass.
Well, I feel like my take on this is so now feels very, very superficial. But from my perspective, it seemed like there was a deeper story here about healthcare for illegal aliens being this kind of headline for what at least I saw Democrats saying was actually something like a 70% cut for many people in terms of their healthcare. And that this was kind of being passed through as a, hidden behind a sort of barrage of rhetoric. And I'm not sure if that's true, but if that is the case, it seems like immigration, once again, is being used. Immigration, which is a problem, a real problem, is being used as a smokescreen for the problem that immigration itself was supposed to solve. That is the ability to, hire cheap labor and support growth, but in the process, immiserate working people in America. And then you have this sort of constant tension between these two things, and immigration being a real problem and actually causing that immiseration is then used as a smokescreen for what is, a real fleecing of everyday working people. And I think that's probably, go on.
Yeah, there is the prospect of more serious cuts to the healthcare Americans are receiving. Some liberal political analysts basically believe that Trump is willing to make a deal and eager to avoid something that would jack up premiums for a bunch of Americans, because that'd be very politically destructive for him. And that's why I think that there are disagreements over healthcare and they're important. My own reading of this is that it has more to do with a broader just opposition between Democrats and Trump, and a desire from the Democratic base to see Democrats fight, and just being in a minority and having somewhat limited resources. The Democrats are fighting now in the way that they feel they can.
Yeah, I mean, that seems likely, but I also think that we should be wary of an ongoing and increasingly powerful attempt to just kind of raise revenue in any way possible. That I think I'll talk about when we talk about things like ID cards, that the situation is going to get quite bad. Let's talk about those
ID cards, Ashley. So you are not a British subject, right?
I am not.
I don't know if it's implied to ask about someone's nationality status, but you're kind of you're a Canadian citizen, I guess.
Look, I am a subject of the crown, nonetheless.
Of the crown.
I could always vote.
But the Canadians don't have to take the IDs, even if they have the king. But you've spent many years in Britain, and what do you make of this? First of all, is it going to happen? Are digital IDs coming to Britain, or is it being fought off?
Yeah, it's so difficult to tell, and I think the outcome of this is going to speak volumes for the future of society. I've drunk the Kool-Aid here, but I really think this is like an epochal moment, like COVID was, and the immediate anger that this was greeted with, I think, was a good sign. And I just happened to have been listening to Times Radio. And I turned on Times Radio and I just caught the tail end of this woman at the Labour conference, which is going on the past couple of days. And I didn't catch her name, but someone told me afterward it was the editor of The Eye, which is not surprising. But she said, I've been really surprised by the opposition and the controversy surrounding digital ID. Especially on civil liberties grounds. I thought that after COVID, the conversation moved on from that. I thought people were willing to accept more government intervention in their lives. And this was such an extraordinary case of this woman saying the quiet part out loud, because digital ID is something that is an agenda that has been pushed for nearly 20 years. It was a Blairite thing. And they have tried. I used to joke that the government has like a special task force that just sits on the sidelines and reads the news and finds an issue. They're like, we'll tack it to that. It's like potholes. They're like, you'll be able to report potholes. Like, it was like immigration. Aha, here it is. Now we're trying to portray ourselves as the patriotic party now, try to steal some of that light from Farage. We will frame it as anti-immigration. What an extraordinary blunder. What an extraordinary blunder, because they've managed to get a lot of stuff passed that is essentially at its core illiberal. Online Safety Act. How did they get that? Think of the children. Don't you worry about what your children can see online? Yeah, of course we all do. But now you're treated like a child until you prove otherwise. So if they can guilt trip you, and if they can bring children to the fore, they can usually be successful. COVID was also an example of this, although they substituted children for old people. And now with euthanasia, we all know that was a smokescreen. But with this, they can't do that, because they've decided to pander to, in their minds, pander to the so-called racists. So how can they guilt trip you, right? They themselves are sort of pretending that they're doing something quite being renegades and introducing this. And yeah, so this idea that it's going to stop the boats, it's going to stop the undocumented work, the black market, whatever, all the gray economy. It's going to stop all of this, which is the most ludicrous thing in the entire world. It's very clearly not about that. Starmer was questioned in a TV interview recently with a presenter.
It's kind of baffling, because if people are entering the country illegally and often entering into kind of informal working arrangements, why would a digital ID prevent that? It's only people who are proceeding in a regular and legal way who would be encumbered by such a thing.
Obviously, they don't like it's actually amazing to me how frequently the government uses this tactic, or like policymakers use this tactic, where they will pretend that the law currently doesn't cover something, which it absolutely does. Already, when I first entered the UK, I got a stamp in my passport that said no recourse to public funds. Starmer's making it sound like that you do when you come in, and we're going to change that. This is going to change. No, you're not supposed to have recourse to public funds already. You already have to, like, militantly, before you start work, show your passport, show your visa. I know, because every time I've had to do anything, they get all my details, right? My passport's photocopied to all ends of the UK. That is already the case, and he's sort of pretending like that isn't. And like these people who are operating the black market, like, well, now I need to ask for your papers. Like, no, they didn't ask before. They're not going to ask now. But it is truly very convenient. Perhaps I should. No, they didn't ask before. So obviously this is a charade. And then the question is, what is it really about? What is it really about? And I'm trying very hard right now not to put on a tinfoil hat. I do want to sound quite reasonable here, but I find it really interesting that over the past couple of weeks, I've started to realize that things are ratcheting up in somewhat quiet ways and in different ways in many different sectors, moving toward a different kind of warfare. And I'm going to write about this for Compact and sort out exactly what I think, and make it not sound crazy. But I do think that we may move toward forms of digital warfare and digital forms of control that are tied to an extraordinary crisis, an extraordinary economic crisis that is going to demand extraordinary means. The trouble is that how you get out of a crisis is often by utterly fleecing people, just trying to kind of, small businesses go out of business, and you buy up their assets cheaply. People are out of work, factories lay idle, and then you can have real destruction in the form of war, and you can just wipe things out, build it again, right? That's one way. You've got all this money sitting in accounts that can't be invested. You can just flatten. That's how we got out of the Great Depression. Just flatten two continents, build them again. The trouble is two things. One, when you have an enormous crisis, you radicalize people. People get really angry. They start asking questions. They get mad. This is what happened during the last crisis. It's a very difficult and volatile thing to try and manage. And during COVID, which I think was utilized opportunistically to manage some deeper economic issues, you saw the way that goodwill and being a good person was weaponized in order to facilitate this agenda. That sounds very tinfoil hat. But so these sorts of situations, they do radicalize people. And then the second issue with the capital destruction, is what I'm talking about, that needs to happen, is that you can't really go to war anymore in a big way. You can have little wars through proxies, which is what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine. The EU is just absolutely desperate. They're drawing up war plans. They're desperate to go to war with Russia. But the trouble is, when you have country-on-country warfare in the age of nuclear weapons, we all know mutually assured destruction. So you can't just flatten continents anymore, because the risk is you flatten the whole world. And, I remember, 2007? Tony Blair gave a speech. It's always stuck in my mind, where he said, we're living in an era where utterly for the first time, something like that, we may never go to war, never have to go to war, may never see our children go to war, may never send our children to war, something like that. And when I heard him say that, I thought, he's wrong. I think we will. But it'll be a different kind of war. And so we still have, this destruction needs to happen in some way. And I think, I was just in Brussels and my flight was delayed. They had to write my boarding pass on a piece of paper with pen because there was a cyber attack. And I think, these are the new fronts. This is the new kind of destruction. And there will be surely hot war and that kind of destruction. But I think part of what is happening here is a kind of mass digitization of warfare, of control, whose underlying purpose is not like, or driver is not, if you look online right now, it's everybody posting clips of Tony Blair at the World Economic Forum. It's not these, quasi-Jewish, conspiracy theory people, puppet masters. It's a very banal issue at the heart of our economy, that there's a lot of money sitting in accounts that cannot be invested profitably. When you have that situation, it is extremely dangerous. And we've been heading down this path, down this hill, this mountain, I don't know, cliff for a long, long time, for maybe probably since the last economic crisis, which we never really got out of, but in a real way of managed decline since 2019. And I don't think that decline, they're still trying to manage it. And I think digital ID is kind of part of that, because the concern is that it will be linked to your bank account. We've already seen slowly baby steps toward, you're protesting, your bank account gets frozen in Canada. You've got the police knocking on people's doors in the UK constantly for posts on social media. This kind of creeping authoritarianism that these digital IDs will no doubt, for your own good, for your well-being, be utilized for. I know that sounds completely insane, but I think we have to be really worried, really careful here. Remember the lessons of COVID, that we cannot give the government. Yeah, I know people are like, oh, who cares? It's just facilitate things. Do you really want to give the state, which is constantly showing itself to be desperate to control your behavior in order to make things work in a society that's heading downhill, do you want to give them that power? It's a terrifying possibility.
Yeah, I was reminded of being in England in the early 2000s and learning about how there were an incredible number of surveillance cameras everywhere in London. This was a legacy of the Blair government, that really you could sort of track, an individual who walked from one end of London to the other could basically be captured the entire way by surveillance cameras. And so, this kind of trade-off by which you accept greater surveillance, you accept this kind of panoptic gaze of the state in exchange for greater security. It does seem, and this was Tony Blair, so it seems like he's been, and he'll come up in our next topic too. But it seems like this has been kind of a that Britain has been a kind of frontier for this sort of expansion. Now, obviously, there's another way, and this is like my only, I don't know if it's a quibble, but it is interesting to me that basically, particularly in the United States, there historically was a lot of, hostility and suspicion about these kinds of possibilities. But two things. One, I'd say the right, the political right, which is ascendant now, has basically two issues by which it can sort of attempt to implement the same agenda. The first is terrorism, and the second is immigration. Now, obviously, you're entirely right that this digital ID is sort of a solution to the immigration problem is kind of absurd given the significance of the informal economy and the fact that that's not going to be controlled. Now, that isn't that isn't necessarily or entirely true, because basically the way that China and India have approached this is, if you just essentially outlaw cash or kind of remove cash from the economy to the greatest extent possible, then you can basically just bring the informal economy into the formal economy. You can just absorb it into the formal economy. And so, this is what China did very concertedly over the past couple decades. And so there, if you buy some scallion pancakes on the street or something in Shanghai, you pay with WeChat or Alipay. Like you don't pay with cash. So there are ways that this agenda can be this kind of digitization of everything can be used in order to absorb the formal economy into the informal economy into the formal economy. And I believe, Asia is kind of at the forefront of that. But the point is, there's sort of a few
and everything else
paths.
Horrible that comes with it. They're at the forefront of should be added.
But sorry, the point I was trying to make is there are a few different paths. I mean, this I think this sort of Starmer, Labor proposing digital ID path is politically maybe the least effective way of doing it, because it raises people's suspicions. Whereas I think, probably the more effective way of doing it is through kind of commerce and convenience. If you just say, well, and this is, I was going to say this about the surveillance cameras. It's like in the UK, they basically accepted that as a trade-off for greater safety, ostensibly. In the US, that would have been a harder sell. But on the other hand, now people have these these sort of digital, like smart doorbells or whatever that have cameras. And so in fact, there is a pretty extensive surveillance apparatus through that doesn't, I mean, of course the cops maybe have to get warrants to look at some of this footage and so on. But nonetheless, there are other ways of doing this, or you can simply expand the scope of digital payments in order to facilitate ease of commerce, as has been done in places like China. And that also has the convenient effect of bringing, more and more areas of economic activity under the sort of gaze of the state. And so I think that's, that's sort of another way that this logic is working itself out. I wonder whether this digital ID thing is kind of it's ultimately a setback because it's like too obvious and it's sort of too easy to object to on political grounds, where there are these other means by which it can be done. Obviously, if you have a war, terrorism, it's interesting though. I mean, we've had the Charlie Kirk assassination and the attack on the ICE facility here. It does really seem to me, compared to, maybe this kind of goes back to, even though this administration is obviously more competent in execution than the first Trump administration, they do seem to still kind of lack the follow through to do something like, I mean, obviously the Kirk assassination wasn't, even though it was sort of treated as some kind of great turning point in the history of America and Western civilization by, at the memorial. It obviously didn't quite have the impact of something like 9/11, but nonetheless, it does seem that despite all of this kind of revival of war on terror rhetoric and so on, the administration does not seem to have it together to pull off something like the Patriot Act or the various other measures taken by the Bush administration, which was far more competent and effective at expanding the sort of apparatus of state surveillance and control. I don't so far see this administration as being particularly good at follow through on that sort of thing. I could be unfortunately proven wrong, but it's also interesting. I was thinking, just one other stray remark. I was thinking with this digital idea about the COVID vaccine passports or whatever, and I mean, it always struck me how in theory, you had this thing on your QR code. You had this thing on your phone that was issued by the state of New York that was a QR code, and that you were supposed to use to get into these places that were limited to the vaccinated. But in fact, I never actually saw one of these QR codes scanned, and I knew many people who had fake ones, and so it was actually quite easy to get around it. I knew many people who faked
what they want to solve
vaccine
now.
passports. So, similarly, I'd say our American security state just doesn't seem entirely competent to pull off stuff like this. I mean, the COVID thing sort of seemed descriptively quite authoritarian, but in practice, it was actually very easy to. It was similar to these kind of rather incompetent 20th century authoritarian states that were actually just quite easy to sort of trick and deceive and get around. So it seems like maybe our sclerotic governance is sort of doing us a favor, at least in the US, because we don't actually have people who are competent or serious enough to really pull off the fantasies of total control that they would like to that at least on some days they would like to force on us all.
Okay, but the reason why people were able to get around those restrictions and made an effort to do so is because there's only so much you can do by making pronouncements as a society. If there is some social function, something that needs to happen, people will get around restrictions. They will. And you see this like when people try to regulate the economy and people who immediately try to get around the regulations, not because they're jerks or something, but because there is some kind of push, there's some kind of need there. And states, often not understanding this, will just try harder. And this is the thing. This is, and one of those things, that's exactly what Tony Blair had. Another one of those things that Tony Blair had said was that we need digital ID in order to be able to track people's vaccines, and it would be linked to your biometric data, which is a hint at the awareness of the desire to get around some of this stuff and to clamp down on it as hard as possible to make it impossible. When you have that kind of situation, that's really bad because there's still a desire and need. There's something in society, but the state will try harder to come down and to stop something from happening. And that's bad in terms of like allowing the flow of things in society, which might include disease, but also like us being social being or commerce or whatever it might be. But they will put that down and they sort of put that draw, I don't know what I'm trying to say, like that gate up, and they will simply try harder. And I think, what you said about the need they should have passed it off as just something that would allow for convenience. They did do that too. They released these little patronizing videos of like, it's just this thing. It's no big deal, which is I see this lobbyists do that all the time. It's not a big deal. It's, it's going to make things easier for us. And people didn't buy that because they had already tried under so many different guises to pass this off, and convenience was yet another. It came across as yet another guise. Well, I think, just giving you my national insurance number is quite convenient. I don't need anything else. There's no reason for anything else. So convenience doesn't work either. However, in terms of getting rid of and sort of formalizing the informal economy, this is true. And I don't doubt that those in power truly believe that digital ID is simply something that will ease and digital currency and getting rid of money. Absolutely. This is something that will simply make things easier. It will allow for the flow of commerce. It would get rid of the informal economy without a doubt. But it would also allow for lots of other things that they need to do that I think are a lot more problematic. In that you mentioned like authoritarian societies, sort of like wet dream of people sort of having this full control and how crappy it was in practice. Well, why though? Why did these societies wind up becoming so obsessed with their citizens' behavior? Because they were on the decline, and they could not admit to themselves that society itself, the structure of society itself, was the problem. And they had to say, no, it's the people who are the problem. And people will solve problems. They will go about, when something needs to be done, they will do it, regardless of what rules are in place. And instead of seeing that, they came down harder and harder on people. And I think that is what we're doing in our society. We're coming down harder and harder on people, becoming obsessive about people's behavior, things like carbon footprint and so on. This is not a good situation to be in when you have people talking about linking digital ID to currency. And another interesting thing too is I see this so many times. I've seen this so many times where things that socialists had predicted sometimes 100 years ago, but at least decades ago, come true, but within a dystopian kind of world. So socialists have often said, and you can go back to like the critique of the Gotha program, that the solution to some of the problems of money in capitalist society would be to have something like a labor chit. And more recently, some socialists said, well, really the solution is to have non-transferable labor vouchers. Now that sounds a lot like digital currencies, in that they can be linked directly to you in your sort of biometric data, and that this would solve some problems. But I find it very interesting that we get these kinds of quasi-socialist sounding solutions like, the famous, like, you'll own nothing and be happy, in a world in which capitalists still own everything. You have like the withering away of the state. Again, this, Lenin said the state, well, drawing on Marx, like the state eventually withers away. Well, now our state withers away. It does very little useful except become the administration of people. And I find that a really interesting and worrying development that speaks to the decline of our societies in a world in which there isn't anything to replace them. So you get this kind of dystopian nightmare of solutions that simply come down harder and harder on the behavior of people because there is no alternative. We can't accept the situation of decline in which we find ourselves.
Geoff, how excited are you that Tony Blair is going to be involved in the Gaza peace plan? I know you're a big fan.
Yes, absolutely. The great, people think that Curtis Yarvin is the great theorist of techno-feudal, sort of high-tech commercial city-states. But in fact, Tony Blair, is the real mover and shaker on this front, as Nathan Pinkoski demonstrated in his review of Blair's book about leadership last year, which I recommend people check out, in which he argues that, Blair is a kind of Machiavelli for the 21st century. And so it's entirely appropriate that this strange proposal, which, is, I suppose this is kind of the serious version of like the meme. If people recall, what seems like eons ago, earlier this year, Trump posted this AI video of the future of Gaza as this sort of, Dubai-like city-state. And there's like a scene of Trump and Netanyahu drinking, pina coladas on the beach or something. And, this kind of glittering skyscrapers and resorts and a Trump casino. And so, I think this is sort of the serious version, although many people are interpreting it as an attempt to make a proposal that Hamas can't accept, so that then Hamas's refusal to accept it will be a sort of blank check to let Israel just kind of continue to reduce Gaza to rubble. That may be the case, but this proposal is an interesting document, in part because I think it demonstrates this sort of curious aspect of Trumpism as a sort of governing philosophy, which is that on one hand it would seem to be the quintessential kind of post-globalist reassertion of sovereignty and of politics as having primacy over economics. So in other words, the idea of Trumpism is that you elect a leader who essentially runs the economy, who doesn't defer to neutral technocratic experts, but instead, runs the economy like he would run his own business, which is a kind of strange form of kind of post-political technocracy itself, but nonetheless, does reassert the position of the elected leader of the sovereign state as the ultimate decider, to use George W. Bush's term, over economic matters. And so this would seem to be a reversal of the decades of neoliberal globalization, in which essentially the elected leaders' ability to make fundamental decisions about the economy was highly constrained, and instead the economy was left in the trusty hands of sort of neutral technocrats like Jerome Powell or Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, etc. And so it would seem that Trumpism is the overturning of this in favor of the reassertion of the nation, of sovereignty. And yet, what's fascinating in this document, the Gaza Peace Plan, is that it explicitly says that this will be an apolitical, technocratic, the governing board, or however it's referred to, that will run this will be an apolitical, technocratic entity. And so there is this odd kind of way that the two things that seem to be opposite, there's a kind of Mobius strip by which they actually end up meeting and converging with each other. So I'm still sort of trying to figure out the logic of that, but I think it's quite fascinating, because I think part of the logic of it is that, okay, so Trump is a reassertion of the elected leader as the ultimate decider on economic matters. Yet, how is the elected leader conceived of here? Well, in his own terms, he said, the American economy is a department store, and I run the department store, so I get to decide the prices. And what he means by prices there is kind of interesting, because what he means is the price that foreign sellers of goods pay to enter the market. In other words, the tariffs. Now, of course, it's actually domestic consumers of goods or domestic purchasers of those goods, wholesale purchasers of those goods, who actually pay the tariff. But nonetheless, so there is this kind of odd way that the reassertion of the primacy of politics and of the elected leader kind of reconverges with a certain kind of technocratic fantasy. But it's not a technocratic fantasy of this kind of completely distributed decision-making through kind of Hayekian self-regulating markets, which is the fantasy of sort of neoliberal globalization, that you just let the markets resolve things on their own. There's no decision maker at the top. Instead, what we're seeing is the reassertion of the figure of the planner, of the person who stands atop this economic structure and makes decisions for it. And so it's interesting to me, just to conclude this remark, that you have Trump here converging with a figure who seemed to represent the opposite, or the prior dispensation, which is Tony Blair, right? A key figure of the sort of period of neoliberal globalization, of the kind of embrace of Hayekian decentralized horizontal market, distributed decision making, and that in the meantime, since his time in office ended, Blair has spent much of his time kind of consulting with various sorts of third world autocrats. And so it does seem like on some level he's come in his own way to accept this kind of modified version of the rule of the market, which is that you still need the rule of the market. You still need this kind of commercial, apolitical, technocratic, kind of undermining of politics. And yet there has to be a figure at the top who essentially rules that system dictatorially. And so that is basically the kind of Curtis Yarvin idea of monarch. What is a monarch? Well, a monarch is just a CEO. And so I think it's interesting that you see these figures who seem to represent opposite dispensations converging here. And of course, Gaza, here is just perceived as the ultimate blank slate. It's this territory that's been reduced to rubble. And so it's a perfect, you could argue it's a repeat of something like what we saw in Iraq. It's a kind of it's conceived of here as a kind of laboratory for new modes of governance. And obviously the local inspiration is also the proposed source of funds for this project, which would be the Gulf states. And the Gulf states are, really the place in which this vision, in which you have a kind of, technocratic monarch, and, particularly embodied in, I'd say, the figure of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who, previously, I think there was this, the sort of sheikhs and emirs of this region, they were supposed to kind of take a back seat and not be particularly energetic or aggressive. But with MBS, you have a new vision of this figure, which I think, again, converges with this notion of the kind of CEO monarch, who is a sort of energetic planner, sort of central planner, but is not a kind of purely cold, calculating central planner, but who's kind of idiosyncratic energy and in a way kind of willingness to engage in violence and brutality in order to, push through his agendas is crucial to his role kind of operating at the top of this structure. So, what I think this Gaza peace plan represents is a kind of fantasy of, here's this blank slate, this kind of place we can turn into a laboratory for experimenting with this new mode of politics that all these figures are kind of converging on, whether they're Donald Trump or Tony Blair. So that's how I see it. Again, it may come to nothing, but it does seem to be nonetheless indicative of a kind of broader direction that global politics is taking in this kind of post-neoliberal era, which is not quite what populism was supposed to be. It's a little bit different.
Indeed. With that, thanks to Ashley, thank you, Geoff, and thank you, listeners. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.